Welcome to Relationship Equity, a podcast that explores how successful people cultivate meaningful connections with others in their personal and professional lives. Learn from the stories, insights, and advice of leaders, innovators, and influencers who have built strong bonds with their teams, their customers, their communities, and their families. Here's Richard Walker.
I'm joined today by Graham Allcott, a renowned thought leader, entrepreneur, and author. In his latest book, Kind, he explores how kindness is not just a moral imperative, but a strategic advantage in business. Graham, before we get started, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, all right. So I grew up near Birmingham in the very middle of England.
You don't sound like a Brummie.
I'm from Rugby originally, which has a slightly softer accent.
Right.
Which is about 30 miles from Birmingham. And then, like many people who live in the landlocked Midlands, I gravitated to the sea. So I'm talking to you right now from Brighton on the south coast, which is like an hour south of London for people listening outside the UK. So my career has been a bit of a journey really through. The first part of my career was in charities. And then I went into doing strategic consulting for 2 or 3 years. And then it was kind of through that and basically working for myself that I discovered the need for productivity and organization and systems for everything that I was doing. And that led me to becoming the founder of a business called Think Productive that's still going today. So we started in 2009, still going strong. And then the next part of the career was I was running that business and I wrote this book called How to Be a Productivity Ninja, which was originally just going to be a kind of showcase of some of the ideas that Think Productive was taking out into our corporate clients. And then it just became this global best-selling book. So that got me into writing, and I'm now 6 books in, sixth and final being Kind. That's really been the work over the last kind of decade or so has been writing and then speaking and, podcasting and taking the ideas from the books out into the world. So, yeah.
6 books. I wrote 1. Thought I'd never finish the damn thing. How the hell did you write 6 books? You're still a young fella. How did you pull that off?
Well, do you know what? It was way easier when I was younger because I didn't have kids to, distract me from it. That's why I say that this last one, Kind, the Quiet Power of Kindness at Work, is definitely the last one.
Let's talk about that last one because that word kind, it slapped me in the face.
Yeah.
It really did. And because it's not a word you often associate. I do a lot of leadership training and I've been involved in many leadership trainings from being a student. And the whole concept of leadership and human dynamics fascinates me. But the word kindness you don't see it on many lists, which is obviously why you wrote about it. I mean,
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
But let's talk about that. I mean, what inspired you to write about kindness as a key to success in the workplace?
Yeah. Well, the word kind is quite interesting, and I had quite a long and challenging conversation, let's say, with my publisher, where I was saying I need the word kind to be slapped across the front of the book, and I need it to be in capital letters, so that it's this word that you think of as being quite soft,
right?
And it's a word that you think of as being quite meek, and I wanted it to be on the front page of the book, like strong, in your face, bold, capital letters. And I won that battle in the end, but it was quite an interesting process because it kind of teased out the fact that when you look at the cover, it's in big, massive letters, but it's kind of on this kind of cream white background. So that kind of really talks about the quiet power of kindness at work. And I think that's why I wanted to write the book, because it feels like in some ways there are some big contradictions when we think about kindness. We can think about it as being this pillar of strength that enables us to develop more trust in the people around us, develop more empathy, and ultimately develop more psychological safety in teams, which is just a marker of high performance. You look at all the literature around this, a lot of which I cite in the book. And basically, if you have a psychologically safe team, which basically means that people feel able to raise the alarm, take an interpersonal risk, then you have a team that performs to a really high level. High performing teams are psychologically safe teams. So, for me, it was like, on the one hand, you can see kindness like that. There's this very obvious link to performance, but a lot of people's thinking about kindness, a lot of people's conceptions of kindness are that it's soft, that it's meek, that it's something that doesn't have a place in business. So that was why I wanted to tell that story. It felt like one of those books that, whenever I talk to people about the idea, there was this kind of really polarized response. And I think there's always something interesting in that, when you find that people are either massively on your team or massively opposed to what you're saying, then for me, that's where there's a book.
Well, I'm massively on your team. I'm one of those people. I couldn't agree more with the whole concept. But how do you address people that don't agree, that say it's soft, that say it's ineffective, that say you don't need kindness in the workplace, just get your damn job done? How do you address that with that mindset? Because in my not so humble opinion, I think I think you just said it. There are two schools of thought. People that agree. There's not much in the middle, I don't think. People either probably completely agree with the concept or they disagree with the concept. How do you address it with the people that don't buy into the whole philosophy of kindness in the workplace as it relates to productivity?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll answer that question in a second. But before that, what I want to just say is that I've been quite surprised since the book came out how many more people are on Team Kind than on the other team, which I
Right.
call Team Screw them all and the evil. Um,
Roughly what percentage would you say were on the team kind?
I'd say it's like 90-10.
Really?
Honestly, I think most people, when you really boil it down and you start thinking about just the obvious win, 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 win of kindness, people get it. I think
Yeah.
people really do get it. And so what's interesting is that people get it conceptually, but then also there's a need to make that practical. So the first half of the book was really about addressing the cynics, because my
Yeah.
idea was that people would buy the book, they would be on Team Kind, but they would be buying the book for their boss or their coworker who they thought perhaps wasn't on Team Kind. And it's almost like a see me kind of book, right? Like, I want you to recognize that this thing's really important to me, read this kind of thing. So the first half of the book was designed to address the cynics. And the second half of the book was designed to say, hey, here's a whole bunch of tools and strategies and things that you can do. And there's a whole bunch of challenges and all of this stuff, to improve your kindness, because I don't think there's any such thing as a kind person or an unkind person. I think there are kind acts and unkind acts. So all of us have the capacity to be unkind, and all of us have the capacity to be kinder than we were yesterday. And it's a practice, right? So, there's something about doing that every day and just being aware of it every day, which I call kindfulness in the book. But the idea of just constantly having that as a lens to look through as we're doing our work and saying, how can I, in this space, bring more kindness to this space? And also, how can I inspire other people to bring kindness into the space as well? But yeah, back to the whole thing about how do you address the cynics? I mean, often you address the cynics by talking their language, which is performance and stats and research, and like, here's actually some evidence for this. It's not just fluffy, and so there's a lot of that in there. And then I think the other thing is you got to think, where is that cynicism coming from? And a lot of it comes from these big misconceptions about what does it mean to be a good leader or entrepreneur or business person. And we are bombarded with the archetype in the book. I call it in the book the business bastard archetype.
Right.
And right now you don't have to look very far to find those, right?
Right.
So you can think right back in sort of literature, right back to Shylock in Shakespeare. You can think about all these Dickensian characters like Ebenezer Scrooge, and you can get right through to Wolf of Wall Street, and arguably social media memes today. Donald Trump, Shark Tank, Dragon's Den, Elon Musk, all of this stuff. There's so much of this archetype out there, which basically says, if you're a business person, you are unkind and conniving. You're probably some kind of megalomaniac genius. And kind of alongside that whole business baddie, business bastard kind of archetype, it's just like this notion that the wealth creators don't play by the same rules. And so if we want to create wealth, we need to just ignore their bad behavior and just let them be unkind, let them be, be evil, because that's what's going to bring about, success and innovation and all the rest of it. And basically in the book, I just absolutely just call that out. And what I say is there are a couple of exceptions to the rule. I would say Steve Jobs was an exception to the rule. He was an incredibly gifted communicator and marketer who happened to be quite unkind to his staff. And I interviewed a couple of his staff in the book. But he was the exception to the rule. Most people, when you think about most bosses, most colleagues, are good people trying to do the right thing. And yes, could probably be kinder, but couldn't we all? And so I think when you recognize that it's an exception to the rule rather than the rule, and you also recognize that there are some other reasons that we put an emphasis on that. Partly because baddies are much more interesting characters than goodies in films. It's just more interesting. It's way more interesting to hear about the baddie than it is to think about someone being kind. Just more interesting. And also survivorship bias plays a factor, right? So we never talk about the unkind leaders who screwed up their businesses or screwed up their companies because they were being unkind. We don't hear about those people because they've fallen by the wayside. You can think about recent examples of that. Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos is a really good example of that.
Right.
She pitted one team against each other. It was a very unkind, destructive culture. Lying was at the center of it. And I talk about her story in the book as well. But that's been a big story over the last couple of years. Where will we think about Elizabeth Holmes in 10, 15, 20 years? It will be forgotten. So a lot of the time, these unkind leaders who sort of come to prominence, they come unstuck, you can think about Donald Trump bankrupting casinos. There are so many examples of people who try and throw their weight around as if unkindness is their strength. And actually what it results in is businesses that fall apart and teams that lack cohesion and a lot of stuff that doesn't get done.
We talk about company culture a lot, and we have a training program, and one of the modules is about company culture. And kindness, I think, is an extremely important part of a company's culture.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that as it relates to culture? I mean, we always talk about culture, and as some people, they roll their eyes at the importance of company culture. Well, to me, it's everything. It is everything. I mean, for a lot of different reasons. I only want to work at a company that's got a kind culture. Now, fortunately, I have a lot of influence in my company, and frankly, there are people that have interviewed with our company and it wasn't me doing it necessarily, that ruled people out that had a tremendous performance track record. They were deemed to be unkind people. Now, you said you don't believe there are kind people and unkind people, and I think you can argue for and against that. But I do agree that there are some people that are much more likely they do kind acts every single day. Now, let me ask you about that. I mean, you were going into human psychology now, and what makes people who they are. Do you believe some people are born kind and some people are born unkind? Is it societal pressures? Is it their upbringing? Why? I'll put it this way then. Why do you think it is that some people are more likely on a daily basis to perform kind acts, whether it's at work or not? And why are some people more prone to not be that way and to perform more unkind acts?
Okay, so one of the bits of research that I quote in the book is that empathy is a neuroplasticity trait. So that is to say that we can learn empathy and we can become more empathetic and more kind. The exception to that is psychopaths. So if you're a psychopath, you can't learn empathy. That's the point, right? So there's a very small part of the population who are in that psychopath bracket who can't learn to be kinder because they just lack empathy, like off the bat. But for everybody else, which is the vast majority of us, we can learn to be kinder and we can develop more empathy. And there are ways that we can do that. One of the things I've done a few times over the last few years is run a program called Kindful Leadership, which takes people on a kind of 6-week journey through a lot of the stuff that's in the book. And we set them challenges every week. And what we find is when we set people challenges to do kind acts, what starts to happen is you're looking as you go through your day for those opportunities to be kind. So in the book, I call it the gap. It's the gap between thinking about making someone's day and actually making someone's day.
Right.
And basically, a kind act is when you jump into that gap and you actually do
Right.
something. But when you're set this challenge of being kind every day for a week, then what happens is your empathy levels go up because you're looking for the opportunities, you're looking for those gaps. And to do that, what have you got to do? You've got to scan the horizons, put yourself in everybody else's shoes as you sort of, see them and, and interact with them, work out what they need. And then that's how you then, perform an act of kindness. So if we think about kindness more, our empathy levels go up. And if we're more empathetic, obviously we are also thinking about kindness more. So it's like this loop that happens. When we start to be kinder, we develop more empathy. When we develop more empathy, we develop more kindness. So it's this lovely kind of virtuous circle. And that's something that we can teach, and it's something that we can practice. And that's why I come back to this idea of kindness being a practice. The more we have it on our radar, the more we think about it, the more we make it a really solid intention, rather than just what often happens is it just becomes kind of slightly superficial identity, the hashtag be kind kind of thing. You've got to really kind of put it front and center in an intentional way, and make it, an act rather than an identity. And that's why I say this thing about there's no such thing as kind people or unkind people. Yes, there are people who have shown and demonstrated consistent kindness over many years, and we can all think of them, right, in our lives, like those at the absolute kind of pillars of kindness as we see it. But those people have sometimes been unkind. And if you're one of those people who thinks that you're kind all the time, what I would challenge you to think about is that doesn't mean you're off the hook for tomorrow, right? So we all have like the power every day to bring more kindness to the table. And we also have the power to forget that or neglect it. And the biggest source of accidental unkindness is busyness. A lot of people are not being unkind because they're, sitting there like twiddling their mustache and, rubbing their hands with glee, trying to do bad things. We often do unkind things just because we're too busy and we miss what someone needs, or we say the wrong thing because we're a bit tired. Like all these unintentional acts of unkindness are, they're just, a lot of them are just accidental, and it's not that we're setting out to upset people. So we've got to recognize that. And I think when we start to take away this comfort blanket of we're a kind person or an unkind person, and that means we're good, like that is what allows us to just think about our, what it's like to be on the other end of us,
Right.
and sort of develop that self-awareness and that empathy that just really helps us to be kinder tomorrow.
Well, I think that's why they invented the word sorry in the English language, right? For the times where we are unkind, and typically unkindness usually comes out in the form of words that we wish that we hadn't uttered. Because, I don't think there's one person on the planet that at some point wasn't unkind, but unkind acts can be rectified. They can be dealt with, and
Yeah.
ego. Let's talk about ego as it feeds into kindness or unkind. How does ego play a part in that?
Yeah. So one of the principles in the book is be humble. And, really a lot of that is about how to get out of the way of yourself and get your ego out of the way, when you're in some of these situations. And so like there's a whole bit in that chapter that looks at like the scripts around being humble, which is all about how to sort of diminish the ego. My friend and colleague Grace Marshall has this lovely phrase, you should be the spotlight and not the star. And so it's about putting other people in your culture on the pedestal, praising other people's work, being very quick to give credit, but also as a leader, taking responsibility, right? So great leaders are the ones who give the credit. The success is down to everybody else and down to the team. And then when there's a fault as the leader, actually that's on you, and I think that's just a really humble perspective. But there's a whole series of sort of scripts in the book, and sorry is obviously one,
Right.
but there are ones like, I got that wrong, or
Right.
I've changed my mind,
Right.
or I don't know, let's ask someone else. And I think we're so often in business, we're trying so hard to have all the answers that sometimes we all get into, the sort of the bluster and the blag and the, and sort of trying to speak to things that perhaps we don't know so well. And what it leads to is bad data and bad decisions. And so getting much more comfortable with not trying to be the superhero, not trying to be right, not trying to have all the answers, actually leads to better communication and better performance, because it means we can all put on the table the stuff that we really do know about, and then actually get somewhere that's driven by a bit more expertise.
How do companies? Can you give any examples of companies that you think have got it right as it relates to the word kindness in the company's culture, and how it's recognized or I'll use the word rewarded? Are there companies that you think of, yes, they truly understand the importance of this and it's recognized? Can you give any examples?
Yeah, so I mean, there's in each chapter of the book, there's like the kindness heroes, and a lot of those are leading people in companies, and then some of them are entrepreneurs, and some of them are team members in businesses. One of the ones that is just really good to highlight is Timpson. So Timpson has the most retail stores in the UK of any company, and they basically do key cutting and shoe repairs.
Right.
So they've got, their business is a few machines in each store, and then typically, 1 to 2 people, like serving the customers. And so by far, their biggest cost in their business to their bottom line is people. So you think of Timpson as, retailer, you think of them as this big brand that everybody knows, but really they're a people business. And they understand kindness and its role in developing a really strong culture, like, super well. So there's so many aspects to it. One is just on the customer front end, they empower all their staff that if you see a customer who has a particular need, or you see a customer who it looks like they need an act of kindness that day, up to a certain, sort of budget level, you're just allowed to just go and just do the kind thing. And this has resulted in things like, a guy came into a Timpson store with his daughter. His daughter had a prosthetic limb, and the prosthetic limb was damaged. It was going to take a few weeks for the hospital to be able to sort it out. And it just so happened that the machine that they had in the Timpson store could actually repair this prosthetic limb, and they just did it for free. And guess what that guy does with that information, right? He goes home, he's absolutely elated. How many people has he told this story to?
Yeah.
All right. So that, the word of mouth of Timpson being this, kind, savior in that moment, that positive word goes around to all his friends, and they tell their friends, and they tell their friends. So you got this massive win in terms of just everybody hearing about that story, witnessing it. Then what they do internally, which is really smart, is they say to their Timpson employees, and they've got like a big WhatsApp group and various ways that they do this kind of regionally as well. They go, what have you done this week to be kind? Tell us your favorite stories. And they have kindness awards. So then all the staff hear all the best stories. All the staff think, isn't Timpson a great place to be? So again, you get this ripple effect. Just this one act of kindness can just have this massive, really profound effect in terms of how it promotes kindness. And what you find is when people witness an act of kindness, they are inspired to be kind themselves.
Replicate.
So this replication happens.
Yeah.
And that happens both with colleagues looking after other colleagues. It happens with, everybody just thinking sort of in a more together way, having a better sense of belonging and engagement. So it's just this huge ripple effect. And then they have like a whole bunch of kind policies as well. So they have things like, if your child starts a new school, then you're allowed half a day off to go and take the photo in the school uniform outside the gate, saying, hey, my child's starting, put it on Instagram, and all that. If your pet dies, you get pet bereavement day. You get your birthday off every year. They have holiday homes that you can book as a staff member, so you can have a free holiday. So they have all of these things that go on in the business that are all, you can look at each of them individually and think they're all quite, cost effective, not very expensive things. But what they add up to is something way more valuable, which is a culture that is just totally driven on a sense of belonging, engagement, empathy, and therefore motivation. So many of the chemicals that get released in our brain, either when we do an act of kindness or when we receive one, are the same chemicals that drive motivation, like dopamine, or that drive trust, like oxytocin, the love hormone. So you get these amazing, psychological effects just by thinking about kindness. So Timpson are a really great example. There's a whole bunch of others as well, who I think either as individual leaders running bits of businesses or organizations as a whole, like have a good culture around this. But yeah, Timpson tends to be the one that people relate to, just because keys and shoes feel like a really boring business, right? But when you
Right.
when you break it down and also why does the shop do both of those things? Like, it's quite never asked them that. Seems like an odd combination of things. But I do think when you change that and you go, actually, it's not a key cutting business, it's a people business. And people would be, 95% of their revenue cost, right? Like, just wages, right? So when you look at it that way, it's probably a higher proportion than most other retailers.
Graham, I'm going to call a friend of mine after our conversation today, a very good friend of mine. He is creating a suite of SaaS products that really is, it's all around the welfare of the employee within an organization. He's looking at this from two lenses. One, from the employer, creating the most productive and effective teams possible. And to also acquire the right people that not have only got the skills, but the right work ethic to create a very productive environment. That is the lens of the client, the company. The lens of the employee is, this company is empowering me to be the absolute best I can possibly be with the skills that I have. And first helping them understand the skills they have, because a lot of us, when you first get into business or whatever the field that you're in, you don't really know where your skills are early in your career. And even people later in the career that can realize that I've got skills I didn't even know I had. So it's to create this environment that, from a company standpoint, high productivity. And of course, if you've got employees that are inspired to really, continue their professional growth, then productivity automatically comes. Now, the reason I say I'm going to call this person is because I think this whole philosophy of create a kind culture will absolutely make a massive difference to the ultimate productivity. Because, of course, if you've got people working in companies that they want to be in, and they're being recognized, however they're recognized, well, what does that do to your attrition? You don't have, or you have much less of it. You're going to have attrition, of course. But if people, what's the number one reason people leave their jobs? They don't like their boss and they don't like the culture. That's number one reason. It's a fact. It's not my opinion. That's a fact. So if you can create a culture of not only positive thinking and kindness, but a culture where people truly not just feel valued, but they're given the opportunity to truly achieve the things they're capable of achieving through the skills that they have, how can you possibly not do anything other than win there? So, and I don't really think, obviously it's taken into consideration the whole EQ side of people's skill sets and their interpersonal skills and all that stuff. But this kindness thing, I think, is huge. And I'm sure he would agree with me.
Yeah, for sure. So there's some stats in the book that talk about how if you have a culture of kindness and you have a psychologically safe culture, psychological safety will give you higher levels of retention. So more people stay. Totally with you that on that whole thing. If people join organizations, people leave bosses, right? So if you can have a kind culture and people don't feel like they need to leave because they don't like their boss, that's one thing. And also engagement goes up. So if you've got higher levels of retention, that means people don't leave. You've trained them up. You've invested all this money in them. You don't want them to leave. But then you've also got them more engaged. And so that means they're going to be more motivated. They're going to feel a higher sense of belonging. When, something goes wrong, they're going to step up to the plate and help to fix the thing rather than leaving at 5 o'clock. So you're just going to have a more engaged culture as well. So, kindness and empathy build trust. Trust builds psychological safety. And when you have psychological safety, just everything good happens, right? Higher levels of productivity, higher levels of creativity and engagement. and retention. So all of these things are linked. But the other way to think about this is if you're worried that is too much emphasis to place on culture, like we don't have time to work on our culture,
Right.
we're too busy, whatever.
Right.
You've got to think what's coming down the track, right? And so as Generation Z get more into the workforce, I actually just read a thing today it was like an opinion piece that was talking about there was some lawyers who were junior lawyers, Gen Z, and they were on, I think it was like £180,000 a year, relatively junior. So, they're doing well, but then they're being asked to do these all-nighters, right? The famous sort
Yeah.
of law firm all-nighters.
Right.
And this one particular person said, hey, my family are visiting this week. Can I just request that I do a maximum of 2 all-nighters this week? And they ended up in a discrimination case with the lawyer. The law firm basically saying, well, we need to just govern you to, work as hard as possible. And, this article was basically saying, we need to change this narrative. And perhaps the narrative should be Gen Z are right. Like we can call Gen Z snowflakes. We can say that they're too picky about the way they, approach the workplace or whatever. But also it's because they have access to all the mental health statistics that we didn't have when we were, starting out in companies. They know like how many lawyers are reaching burnout levels within the first 5 years. They have the data. And so they're approaching their work in a much smarter way. And they're asking to have a conversation with the organization about how can we make this a team effort? How can we give ourselves, a sense of safety in the way that we work, and also a sense of dignity and a sense of having some control over the work
Right.
they do. And so, if you think you don't need to work on culture now, I'll tell you, in the next 10 years, we're all going to have to think about culture much more. And, I think Gen Z are going to push the rest of us into some smarter, more dignified, more empathetic, and more caring practices. And I think that's a great thing.
All right, Graham, I want to get into the barriers to kindness and how we can cultivate more kindness in our lives. But we have to stop here. Coming up in part 2, Graham will also talk about the difference between being nice and being kind.
So often in a sort of leadership context, nice is about telling people what they want to hear, and then kind is about telling people what they need to hear. And so I think there's a huge difference between nice and kind. And if we're truly kind, we get to also hold people accountable, to have boundaries, to bring truth into the space, so that we can actually, use that to make sure that everybody's making good decisions. And that for me is a really important part of it as well, is having those boundaries and having that commitment to truth.
This has been Relationship Equity. If you want to take your career, your business, or your personal relationships to the next level, reach out to Richard at yorksolutions.net. You can also get Richard's book, Relationship Equity, your cornerstone investment to great gains in business and life, on Amazon now. Relationship Equity with Richard Walker is a production of Forbes Books.